Welcome to WIDA's Friday Exchange, a media product of the Washington International Trade Association. Each week, we bring you inside the room with former trade negotiators and policy insiders to unpack the latest in trade and tariff developments, what's been announced, what's at stake, and what might come next. Imagine our speakers are sitting at a local pub after a tough week at the office or at the negotiating table, downloading with their colleagues about the latest developments in international trade. That's what we aim to bring you with WIDA's Friday Exchange. New episodes drop every Friday. Subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify to be the first to know when they go live. We are recording this week's episode on Wednesday, August 13th at 3 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So depending on when you download and listen, the trade news may have changed. The past 6 months have seen more trade news than in the past 6 years and in maybe all of our lifetimes. There continues to be a lot of news on trade in the past week and even in just the past 48 hours. With the big China pause. On today's episode, we're going to step back and look at the broad scopes of the changes that President Trump has initiated in the 205 days since he took office and since he first announced his reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd. Today, we are joined by 4 people to help us unpack where things stand with the slew of agreements and tariffs announced over the past weeks and months. Wendy Cutler, Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and the former acting Deputy United States Trade Representative. Dan Mullaney, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the former assistant U.S. trade representative for Europe and the Middle East. Mark Linscott, senior advisor at the Asia Group and the former assistant U.S. trade representative for South and Central Asian affairs. And our moderator and discussion host today, Joe DeMont, chief of international trade policy and global life sciences at Crowell Global Advisors and a former deputy assistant USTR for Asia. Joe?
Hi, Wendy, Dan, and Mark. Looking forward to our discussion today. So it was a week ago or so that the tariffs, long-threatened tariffs, were actually applied on effective August 7th. So I was tempted to think of that old song, "It's all over but the crying," but it's not really all over, is it? I mean, there were a spate of deals done in the run-up to August 1st, which was the deadline the president had imposed. There was a week gap, and then the tariffs were imposed. But then, news started to trickle out in the following days, in some cases right immediately after some of these deals were done. Some deals were not done. We'll get to that. Because most of them really weren't written down. And I don't know what kind of deal that is, if it was a handshake or what you think it was or what it constituted, how it was made. But I wanted to start by just sort of reviewing what we know about these trade deals that were reached. And then, Mark, I'm going to come to you at the end about the big one that wasn't reached, or one of the big ones that wasn't reached with India, and to dig into that. But let's start with a couple of the ones that were sort of last minute deals that were made just before the July 31st executive order came out, starting with Japan and Korea. So when do you follow those closely? And in both cases, I think there's a certain, well, for those of us who follow these things closely, a certain ambiguity as to what was actually agreed on. And what can you say about that?
Well, I think, the point you made, this stuff, it doesn't seem to be written down, at least what they announced. My understanding is there are talks going on with certain countries to memorialize what was agreed to. What I find fascinating is that in Japan, the chief negotiator went home and he said publicly, maybe we don't even want to write this stuff down and get into that kind of negotiation. And I have to believe that he said that because there are still some serious gaps in understanding between what the U.S. thinks they agreed to and what Japan thought they agreed to, particularly with respect, we're going to decide how to spend it on investments in the U.S., while Japan is viewing this as more of a target figure and loan guarantees, and they're going to have a government entity that's going to help disperse this and all of that. So that would be number one. But number two, my other takeaway is that I thought both of these deals, frankly, would be more controversial at home once they were brought home and the announcements were made, even though not in writing. And frankly, both countries seem kind of resigned to these agreements. Korea, with a new president, came in very late to the negotiations. But once Japan reached a deal, it really had no choice but to reach a deal or else fall behind behind, fall behind Japan and get, higher tariff rates. So they scrambled and they did get a deal as well. Again, I think, certain ambiguities for sure. I would just highlight for the group that the new Korean president, Lee, will be coming to the United States around, I think the meeting in the White House will be on the 25th of August. So we may hear more about this and we may hear more details about the Korea deal. I would also there's part of me that's a little wary about this meeting. I think, as we all have seen, when there are leader to leader meetings or phone calls, be careful, because things can come out a little differently than you expected when going into the Oval Office or picking up the phone.
Just to go back a little bit on the agreement, Wendy, the administration's touting that they effectively used their tariff leverage to get Japan and Korea to open their markets. But again, not being written down, what form is that going to take? Is there going to be a piece of paper that, or are Korea and Japan going to take some sort of domestic measures that clarify what market opening they're going to do now?
Well, I mean, that's an excellent question. And I think something that the more I talk to different countries, not just Korea and Japan, that even though it doesn't seem like we need to go through a legislative process for these deals, the other countries do. So they are going to need something in writing. So I would suspect that, probably the USTR folks will be following up, trying to get this stuff memorialized in writing.
Okay, so there is going to have to be some continued process, something, and that would be not only, like you said, with respect to these I would think, with respect to the investment commitments, such as they are, but then also with respect to what the administration got. I'll come back to that, because I want, at the end, I just want to foreshadow that USTR Greer wrote an article in the New York Times this week, and I want to come back to what he said and your interpretation, how people feel about that. But one of the things he did say was that this leverage was used to sort of right the wrongs, that have been done to America, and to, level the playing field. But we haven't really seen any of the detail on that. But we'll come back to that. Dan, I want to turn to you and ask also similarly. The EU also reached a deal shortly before. And again, I don't seen it. Maybe you have some better idea of how it worked. There were some differing interpretations about it. This follows on an agreement made by the UK very early on in the process. You might want to compare one to the other. So, what's happening there? Is there are people continuing to talk to each other, or what do you expect to happen next?
Yeah, the situation with the UK and the EU is I'd say very, very different. UK, we had something written down, only 5 pages, but still 5 pages, with some specifics about tariff quotas for beef, autos, some specific mentions of sector. So we have something written down, and then it was partially at least implemented. So I think now we're in the phase of the ongoing discussions. That's the uncertainty that you spoke of. This is really the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end. And so now we start the discussions to fill out what was agreed. And what was agreed is fairly skeletal, but it does lay out a broad set of issues that kind of reads relatively closely on a comprehensive agreement. So it'll be interesting to see how those discussions unwind, and how much of those broad issues you get to. Then we have the EU, which had a deal which is not written down, and you have sort of 2 levels of uncertainty what happens next. One is what was actually agreed, and there has been some back and forth about that. What sectors are 0 for 0, what happens with pharmaceuticals. I think that was clarified a little bit later. And similar questions about what does the $750 billion in energy purchases mean? How is that going to be implemented? $600 billion in investment. Are they commitments? Are they projections? A certain amount of uncertainty there. But then there's and some of that may be clarified when or if fact sheets or joint statements are issued. Although I'm sure the the same discussion is happening with those parties as you were describing, Wendy, where, do we really want to set down what these are and get into this big discussion of what was actually agreed or not agreed, or is it better just to proceed as if? But then you have the second question, which is, okay, so now we have this deal. How does that unfold? And to what degree are we focusing on collaboration on non-market economy policies and practices to address overcapacity in steel or supply chains in pharmaceuticals? How much, and this is a big unanswered question that is fairly significant for me, how much is the focus going to be on addressing the sort of long list of non-tariff barriers that the United States has cited for years and years with respect to the EU, also with respect to the UK? When the president makes announcements, he just talks about it's unfair. They won't buy our cars. They won't buy our, but behind that broad brush is a very long, detailed list, 30 some pages in the National Trade Estimates report. And so, the question that is interesting is, are the parties really going to sit down and really start to address those? And could that mean some additional tariff relief on the US side in response to that? Or are they effectively an excuse just for maintaining the tariffs?
Or raising them.
Or raising them, because the other factor, of course, is it was, I think, somewhat controversial, the Commission's decision to engage with the Trump administration and not to retaliate, not to take strong action. And I think there were a lot of constituents in Europe that were blaming the Commission for not being as tough or forward-leaning as China and announcing retaliation and being tough. So the Commission came under a lot of criticism. And so although the commissioner, President von der Leyen, and the Commissioner Šefčovič, the trade commissioner, held to the line that no, we're going to try to work out a deal. And I think ultimately they got a very favorable deal, not compared to the situation 6 months ago, of course, but compared to everybody else and compared to the current situation. But as we have these discussions on non-tariff barriers or China or energy purchases, if things start going off the rails, and if the administration starts saying, President Trump in particular, the Europeans are not serious, I don't like this direction, I don't know how long that coalition, if you will, in favor of engagement versus retaliation will hold. And so you may have a situation where the pressure to get strong, like China, the constituents keep saying, that could assert itself. I have a feeling the Commission, President von der Leyen and Commissioner Šefčovič have the things in hand. I think the subsequent message about these deals with the EU is it's terrible because it rejects the multilateral system. We may be doing things that are WTO consistent. It's multiple what the tariffs were 6 months ago. It's a really terrible deal, but it's the best deal under the circumstances, and also necessary for some other important issues like Ukraine, like NATO. There's a very conscious sense that this compromise, as much as many people in Europe hate it, was necessary to keep us all together on some of these bigger issues like Ukraine.
It's so just on one fine point on that, because in terms of getting a better deal than others, we all, I think, probably, because we have to look at the executive order that came out on July 31st, Dan, and it was clear that the EU got different treatment than everybody else. Everybody else had these reciprocal tariffs that were imposed. They were on top of the pre-existing MFN tariffs that the US had. Europe was the only one in that EO that basically the 15% that they got was inclusive, all in. Nobody else got that deal except
Japan.
Wendy. I'm going to bring you in. Okay, Wendy, come in.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so Japan thought they had that deal. And when they looked at that executive order, I'm sure heads were rolling in Tokyo, because they sent Minister Akazawa on a plane immediately back to Washington to clarify that that was the deal they got as well. And now they supposedly been told they have the deal, but, it hasn't been implemented yet. And if the U.S. kind of drags its feet on that, and Japanese automakers continue to pay these higher tariffs than expected, this could create some political problems for Prime Minister Ishiba. Again, as long as everyone's getting what everyone else is getting, or there's a feeling like your main competitors, like, okay, we're all screwed together, then that's one thing. But again,
Right.
this,
Well,
but the EU
but
also had some of the zero for zeros, which are less, which
yeah,
are
which Japan
undefined.
doesn't, but yeah, but
Yeah, so
again,
and those are undefined, defined sectors, and so we'll see. That's also something, I think, a leg up that Europe has over some of the other partners, maybe.
that's yeah.
So, but in terms of this cascade of people looking at their competitors, if Japan indeed did get back the same deal as Europe, does that have implications for Korea then? I mean, I guess the tariff on autos is pretty low,
everybody else, for everybody else who
right.
I think it's got implications.
Yeah, because as far as I know, everybody asked for that. I mean,
right. But the other thing I'd say on Korea is the Korea thought, let's just say on autos, that if Japan got 15, they would get 12.5 because they had an FTA and that MFN tariff wouldn't kick in. Let's just say I don't think they succeeded at the negotiating table in convincing the other side that that's the way things were going to work.
So this might be on Korean Prime Minister's list of things to talk about when he comes. Who knows? Mark, I want to come back to another agreement to Dan in a second in terms of agreements that were not concluded in time for July 31st. But yeah, it would be. But let's talk about the biggest one that was not done, and one that I'm not going to remind you that you were very optimistic. Okay, I just did about this a few weeks ago. Everybody was, and then the first shoe dropped, which was 25%. But then, and that was bad enough. But then the second shoe dropped very late in the process, that the president was going to apply secondary tariffs, so to speak, on India for buying Russian oil, and now there's a 50% tariff on India. So what's your assessment of the state of U.S.-India trade and political relations, and where do we go from here?
Yeah, and I should note when we were last together, I did fully acknowledge that I was wrong. I was very wrong, and that I was no longer making predictions on U.S.-India and whether and when they might get a deal. I think there are a couple of unique. I mean, India's always got to be unique. And I think there are a couple of unique factors with India. And one is, for the moment, beside the point a little bit, but India is the one country with which the Trump administration has explicitly expressed the ambition of doing a so-called bilateral trade agreement. This was back in February when Prime Minister Modi was in Washington. They issued quite a robust joint statement with a lot on trade, and they said they want to do a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement, goods, services, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, et cetera. So they started negotiations in March to do a first phase, and this was before April 2nd, Liberation Day, to start that first phase of a BTA. And that's unique to India. But I think there's also a somewhat unique aspect with India, that there was already political trouble brewing, a special kind of political trouble brewing for Prime Minister Modi in the run-up to these deals. And that was, basically the situation with Pakistan, the terrorist attack, the response to that, and ultimately the ceasefire, and President Trump being very explicit repeatedly that he solved that crisis, that he intervened, and there was a ceasefire because of him and because he tied it to trade. That he said, you two have too much to lose with us on trade. And that created a real firestorm in India, predictably, because there's always been the situation where India does not want anyone to intervene on its relationship with Pakistan, the situation with Kashmir. So it created this dynamic, and particularly after there was a call between Modi and Trump when they could not meet at the G7. And apparently Prime Minister Modi, I think there was a Bloomberg article on this, explained why this was a problem. And, I think that probably soured things even more. So when it came to do a deal, each of these deals, so-called deals, have involved President Trump himself. He's either met or talked to the foreign leader, or he's had a trade minister in town. He's called that trade minister into the Oval Office, and they've done the final terms. No call came from India. There was not that opportunity to, for the president to be the trade negotiator in chief and seal the deal, and announce hundreds of billions of dollars of purchasing commitments and investments. And, I think that was probably the central missing ingredient of doing a deal. And now things are, boy, they went from bad to worse with the situation with Russian oil purchases. That made it even more politically difficult for the prime minister. And they don't yet face a 50% tariff. It's 25%. The other 25% has been delayed
30
until
days.
August 27th, I think.
Yeah.
It's actually not bad timing because the Indians will be out of the monsoon parliament at that of the monsoon session of parliament at that time by August 21st. So there's a window that might be politically easier to resolve it, but it's pretty clear the two leaders need to talk, and they first need to reach some kind of understanding on the Russia oil situation before they can go back to the details of a trade deal.
Right.
So it's a mess. It really is.
And with
Mark,
Trump going to talk to Putin, that's also something that could have an impact on potential. I mean, if he wants to
Well,
claim
I think the Indians
right.
hope it will go
Yeah.
well and have
Right.
a positive impact.
Hey, Mark, there was two things. There was talk of a trade negotiations continuing, a group from USTR going to India in August. Is that still on? And any insight on, the supposed Quad leaders meeting where the president was going to visit India this fall to announce the BTA? Is that totally off track?
I'm not sure whether either of those are on at this point in time. The delegation from USTR going at the end of this month, I think was going to focus not only on what didn't get done with a reciprocal tariff deal, but then moving to the next set of issues for the BTA and getting into issues like trade and services and more details on digital, et cetera. I think that was the plan, but I'm not sure that's going to happen now. It may require some more developments on the Russia oil front before they do that. And then the Quad, I don't know that it was ever clearly agreed by the White House that it was going to happen with the president attending. The Indians seem to think that it was agreed, but I've heard alternative narratives from others in the administration whether it was agreed. And that was always seen as a big moment for progress in the bigger bilateral trade agreement because there would have to be trade deliverables associated with that if Trump was going to Delhi for that Quad leaders meeting. So it's kind of gone quiet on that front. When it goes quiet, then it raises a lot of questions of whether in fact it will occur.
Yeah.
And
All
just
right.
to your one point you raised earlier, and could tariffs go back up? We could see situations in which, these deals that weren't written down, that may have been agreements in principle or framework agreements or whatever they are calling them. I think USTR has not changed that much since we were there, and they still want to nail down details in a legally binding agreement. And if those efforts go sideways, then we could see new threats of tariffs snapping back for those who have
Right.
deals. I wouldn't be
But
shocked to see that kind of scenario.
well, that seems to be one of the implications of, again, the article that Greer wrote in the New York Times, that the enforcement, I want to come back to this point. I mean, raise this point that we talk about legally binding agreements, but what's the enforcement mechanism? If not the unilateral decision of the US that a country is not in compliance and then the application of tariffs? That's how, what it seems like to me. Is there
Yeah, I
Is
think
that-
that's accurate. The US is the judge, jury, and enforcer, right? And so,
executioner,
yeah, we'll make our own decisions on that. There's, I think, what did I think Greer said in that article, just talking about like forget the days of bureaucrats coming together to kind of in a panel to make some kind of decision. And we saw that frankly, in the phase one China negotiations. There was a process where the two sides would talk and try and work things out, but at the end of the day, they couldn't. Then the remedy was you just withdraw from the agreement.
or jack up your yeah. In other
Yeah, I
words, jack
mean,
up your tariffs.
which means that goes hand in hand with
Right.
jacking up your tariffs.
Right. Well, speaking of having your tariffs jacked up, Dan, let's come back to Switzerland. So 39%.
The land
This
of
is
chocolate and watches.
the lads of chocolate and watches and a cuckoo
And
clock
gold.
And
gold. Very sophisticated country, has good diplomats, has good trade negotiators, has one of the worst reciprocal tariff rates in the world.
Mhm.
What in the world? But also a big trade deficit with the U.S. has a big trade deficit with them. So what went wrong, or if that's what you want to call it?
Well, before I comment on Switzerland, I just want to point out that the countries that were under my jurisdiction when I was assistant USTR have done very, very well in this process. The UK, the EU. I don't want to brag. I don't want to brag, Mark, Wendy, but
Well, I did Southeast Asia, so that doesn't you beat me too.
But actually, it does remind me. There's another aspect that we have not really talked about, and a lot of people don't, is that there's this whole basket of countries that are just like left at 10% because I think there were discussions with them, but they weren't the headline. They weren't going to get hit very hard, and so those are also successes. I mean, it's 10%.
Oh, yeah.
I imagine that's on top of MFN, so it's probably more like 10, 15%. But that includes, I think a number of our FTA partners includes, I think, most of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, FTA partners, Bahrain, Morocco, some other parts of Northern Africa like Tunisia, and all of a big chunk of Africa, none of whom were hit by these headline numbers, and they weren't highlighted. But I think in a way they were also successful in this process. I mean, Switzerland is, I think, they do have a very significant trade deficit. It's very particular and I think largely focused in pharmaceuticals, which is also a sensitive topic. I mean, there's some other products, optical equipment and things as well. But I think, and you're right, it's a very sophisticated team, very sophisticated trade negotiation. I think what Wendy and Mark were both saying, that a lot of this comes down to what happens when something goes to President Trump. And even with the EU, you'll recall during this process, there was a deal getting ready to be completed, and there was word that the trade commissioner was coming to meet Greer. And I think the president didn't see what he liked, and so he announced 50% tariffs starting the following Monday. And then, of course, ultimately, then I think President von der Leyen called him, and those were postponed, and everything was smoothed over. So that's how volatile these things are when it gets to that presidential level. The difficulty with Europeans, and I know I'm being circular on this, and that's somewhat deliberate. The difficulty, especially with the Europeans, that they are fairly sophisticated. They have strong opinions that goods trade deficits don't matter. And it is the height of folly to walk into some of these negotiations and say, okay, I'm going to spend most of my time convincing people that goods trade deficits don't matter, especially when you yourself are extraordinarily proud of your goods trade surpluses. So I think if you look at the press conference that President von der Leyen had with Trump, and she said, "Look, we're here." He kept talking about unfairness. They won't buy our autos. They won't buy our pharmaceuticals. Von der Leyen said, "Look, there are some imbalances in the relationship. She called them imbalances, and we're going to address those imbalances. She didn't say whether she agreed with the premise that goods trade deficits are bad or anything like that. She didn't take that on. But I think it is challenging for a lot of economies that are justly proud of the manufacturing dynamos that they are and their export dynamos, and it's hard to maybe not kind of dispute the underlying issue that trade deficits are a problem. So my guess is that a little bit like the earlier situation with Europe, where it was 50%, and then it wasn't. I think as part of the follow-on, we will, I imagine, likely see some arrangement with Switzerland, which reflects more carefully their sophistication and their participation in the market. So I'm looking at that myself. I'm looking at that 39% as sort of a temporary thing. Not entirely temporary, because of course the president said, those are the deals, and that's where the deals are. But clearly, I think there's going to be some follow-up, say with India and other countries. I think Switzerland is probably going to be one of those.
Are there? This is a question for everybody. Are there others out there? I think there are a few that have been quietly talking to try to come to some sort of deal. Maybe Bangladesh. Taiwan, we haven't heard a lot from, but they had their tariffs imposed on August.
Bangladesh did well. I mean, your example, Bangladesh did well. In some respects, it's in the best position it's been in since its GSP benefits were suspended, 12, 15 years ago, something like that. So they actually did well. The question is, can they maintain it? Can any of these maintain? I think Wendy referred to this earlier. This is all relative, or comparative. What's your tariff compared to another country and a country with which you compete in specific product areas? And Bangladesh does apparel. That's what it does.
Right. What was their number? What was their reciprocal number?
20%.
So 20. So that's
with
like
no deal.
With no deal.
With no deal, right?
Okay, so that is
okay.
So
although I wonder whether there are some deals that were not announced, and for whatever reason, and they got special tariff rates that were lower than April 2nd reciprocal tariff rates because there had been discussions. I've been wondering that because otherwise it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense that certain select countries got lower rates than we anticipated for not doing anything. So
anyway. Some had to make a deal. Vietnam had to make a deal to get a 20% rate. They do have, and by the way, they also have a lot of apparel. And what I'm hearing there, of course, is that apparel already has high rates, the range of 20%. So now we're talking a 40% tariff on some of these products. That doesn't sound great.
Unless they get the EU deal.
Unless they get the okay. Yes, which so far others have not gotten.
So can I raise like a bandwidth issue here? Because I think now we're going to see Besson, Greer, and Lutnick very focused on China, right?
let's turn
in an effort to try and reach a deal, by the fall. So maybe the president could meet with Xi either around, the APEC or ASEAN meeting, or actually take a trip to China. And so I think those negotiations, if indeed there's going to be a trade deal to announce by that time, are going to take a lot of attention from the three cabinet officers who are focused on this. And so, I think there was always this idea that maybe after August, for these smaller countries that couldn't get an audience with these guys, could do that. And I'm kind of skeptical that they'll be able to. Frankly, I was kind of shocked when the president of Switzerland came to town and she couldn't get a meeting with any of the three, but was able to see Rubio. But I found that just very hard to explain and understand.
Wow.
So again, I think there will be a bandwidth problem going forward. If we're really interested in doing a deal with China, there are 2 months left, not a very long time. And even though they've started to discuss some of the issues of concern, it's very different to get from a discussion phase with China to actually agreeing on commitments,
Yeah,
particularly at a time when I think China, unlike the phase one deal, they're going to want things in return. They've learned from phase one, which
right.
was largely all the benefits went to the US and China made all the concessions. I think it's going to be a very different negotiation
Well,
this time around.
And they
yeah,
have
so
things they want in terms of, technology, chips,
Export controls
and
for sure. Yeah.
there's clearly, interest in providing that to them. I mean, that signal's been sent.
yeah, and
Yeah,
it's not only from phase one, it's from their experience this time, the tit for tat on tariffs that they did that got the administration to reduce its tariffs a few months ago after April 2nd.
Right.
So that's where that retaliatory approach has worked for China. Arguably, it's also worked for the EU. The two groups that really came forward and said we're considering retaliatory tariffs did get better deals. I mean, but they're also big markets.
Right. For Canada, remember, Canada, I think, still has some retaliation in effect, the only other country besides China, but kind of didn't work their way either. They have a 35% tariff, unlike Mexico, which did really well and got like a 90-day pause.
Right. So what do you think? What's the administration? Who has an idea of what the administration's goals or aims are in a deal with China? What does that look like? What do they want?
So my view is it depends who you ask on the team.
Okay.
I think for the president, I think we're talking about big commercial announcements, and there's even talk about him bringing CEOs with him if he were to, go to China and have it, actually have a trip and meet with Xi and announce all this stuff. So I think there'll be a big emphasis on increased purchases. There was some discussion about maybe inviting Chinese FDI back to the U.S., but Bessent just yesterday
squashed that, right?
he
Yeah.
squashed that. So that seems, at least for now, to be off the table. I think if you talk to Bessent, what he's been talking about is trying to deal with the excess capacity issue vis-a-vis China through structural reforms in China, including having them increase their domestic consumption. I think it's a laudable goal. But frankly, as someone who's worked on with Japan and China on trying to get them to kind of change structural issues in their economy, let's just say it doesn't lend to short-term victories. And I think if you were to ask USTR, I'm sure that they have a long list of non-tariff measures, that they would like to pursue with China, many that have been raised for a long time by the business community. But again, not a very long time, for the negotiation. Also on the table, I think, will be the fentanyl issue, because remember that 20 percentage points of these tariffs are supposedly tied to, China's inadequate actions in terms of preventing the export of certain precursors to the United States. So I think there's a full agenda here, but any deal, in my view, that's going to be reached is going to be a partial deal. And I would hope very much that they agree on a process at the vice premier level and at the secretary of treasury level to continue these talks, because they're not going to get at a lot of this stuff. And it would be a loss if they just make an announcement of a deal that's largely commercial and kind of that's it with China. But again, anything can happen in these negotiations as well, and they could be derailed very easily. Particularly, if you think about like if there are announcements on some of the 232 tariffs with steep tariffs that hurt China, that could stymie progress. And the issue we raised before: does Trump go forward and actually threaten the imposition of tariffs against China for its purchases of Russian oil? So again,
there's another tension here that's worth pointing out, in that the Trump administration is very much focused on getting the EU and UK and others to collaborate with them on some of these China issues. Well, every time the president and her team goes over and talks about working out a deal with China, there's a real concern from the EU that they're going to be sort of, having agreed to push back on China, they're going to be then left out in the cold. So I think, UK, EU, and others are going to watch these deals very carefully to see if it undercuts the cooperation that the United States is also wanting with respect to allies like the EU and the UK.
Well,
Well, exactly.
I'm sorry. The other group that's watching, of course, is the rest of Asia,
Yeah.
Southeast Asia in
Yeah.
particular, but also I'm sure Japan and Korea. I mean, if China has this leverage, is that going to allow them to get potentially even a better deal than some of these other countries? I mean, or is that just not? It seems that a lot of the administration's decisions have been based on the rate that countries get have been based a lot on what the trade deficit is.
I mean, my take
On that, yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Well, and when I defer to Wendy on this, this is an anxiety that India has felt from the very start, and I was skeptical about whether it's a real there's any real concern that should underlie that anxiety, but that China would get a better deal, and their hopes to be attracting investment out of China into India to build up their manufacturing base would be in the dust. That's been the biggest fear.
Yeah.
And I think that it's still pretty unlikely in terms of tariff levels because, sure, there's the 30% tariff, which is still pretty high, but lower than others. But there are still the 301 tariffs, which
Right.
for product by product can be very high. So,
And look, majority of them are 25%. So you're talking about
Yeah, it adds up.
Yeah.
It adds up. Because the other thing that's still outstanding is that the administration is still saying it's going to come out with rules of origin that penalize countries that have over a certain percentage of Chinese content. And that rate they're saying is going to be 40%, at least for Vietnam.
well, it's supposed to be 40% now, I think, isn't it? And we've seen nothing on rules of origin. I mean,
No.
I get headaches when I start discussing rules of origin. There's a period of time when I covered
You're
it.
not alone.
We all
Yeah,
do.
there's a period of time when I covered it in Geneva and I hated it. And then I had the rules of origin negotiators working for me when I was ousted for WTO and I hated it. I mean, it just really, and I get confused, so easily confused, but they are critical when you've got different rates for different countries. I mean, if it's MFN, it's not an issue. If everybody's getting
Right.
MFN, you don't necessarily need rules of origin. But if every country is getting a different rate, and then you've got these new transshipment restrictions, you need some real rules of origin, and who knows what they are going to be.
It's going to be
And-
super. This would be a super. I mean, even what we worked on, I think all of us in the past. This makes that look like a walk in the park. If you have like you said, if you have different rates for different countries, different tariff rates, different rates of content. I mean, it is just a nightmare for CBP, if not everybody else. Sorry, Wendy, I cut you off there.
No, there's a similar point I was going to make. But I would just add, though, I think for the countries who think like, oh, it's just this transshipment tariff of 40%, that's just going to apply to a very small universe. Because in fact, we don't have goods being transshipped through our country. I think they're mistaken because I think what's going to happen is if your product does not meet the new strict rule of origin for 20%, let's just say for Vietnam, you're going to move to that 40% basket automatically. And we could see more trade in that 40% basket, at least in the early years before the 20%, because it's going to take countries and companies time to adjust their supply chains.
Absolutely. And if the ceiling on Chinese content is low enough, let's say if it's below 30% or so, that's going to be very hard for some countries to get around, and especially in Southeast Asia. Okay, I think we're probably on the verge of losing our audience because we're talking about rules of origin. So we should probably cut our losses and finish our discussion on that wonky note. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Wendy, for a great discussion. There were so many other things we could have talked about, but really appreciate it. This is Joe DeMond. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week on WIDA's Friday Exchange.
Thank you for watching and listening to WIDA's Friday Exchange, a media product of the Washington International Trade Association. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. New episodes drop every Friday, and you'll be the first to know. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back next week with WIDA's Friday Exchange.